Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L here to talk about My Hero Academia chapter 329. Hey everybody, I guess we should say the chapter title because it is kind of ridiculous. In the nick of time, a big maverick from the west. Woo, let's celebrate America, great. Anyway, here we are. So guys, chapter 329, I guess general notes first. Oh, and also, you might have noticed that we had a small break on the channel. I was doing family stuff, but I'm back now and we should be going back to regular videos. Well, doing my best. Anyway, this chapter, general notes, I do find it to be light. I don't think there's a lot to really consider aside from All for One's words, because All for One, it's always a point of trying to figure out what exactly he wants. But in terms of general notes, yeah, I don't think it's a particularly dense chapter. I think it's relatively simple because it's pretty much hype up for Star and Stripe. If you look at it, quite a chunk of the chapter is dedicated to her. And when it's not her, it's pretty much just updating what the villains want to do. Like, you have a sense of what All for One wants to do. You have a sense of what the other members of the League of Villains are doing, sort of. And then you get a sense of what Skeptic wants to do. So it's pretty much just saying, like, hey, here are the things we want to do. Hype up Spinner, hype up Star and Stripe. Alright, cool. Now, aside from that, I think one of the more interesting things is Star and Stripe herself. Not the character, because the character is non-existent. We know nothing about her other than she's a good person. No. I'm more interested in what exactly she represents in the story. And allow me to just give you my thoughts here, but I do find Star and Stripe very weird to have her at this moment. It's not weird that we have an international hero. When it comes to the international heroes, I expected 2 or 3 to show up and have about as much relevance as Best Jeanist does. But Star and Stripe, she comes in here as this new element, and we're being told that actually she is one of the most critical elements in this whole game. And that itself is the weird thing. It's one thing to have the #1 hero of America coming in here. It's another thing to have All for One in the same line that he kind of talks down his fascination with One for All. He also elevates Star and Stripe, you know, telling us that she's the greatest obstacle. You know, all this blow up for this character, that's what makes it feel kind of strange. Just because this is such a big character, and yet we're all so focused on All Might. And when it comes to like the rhetoric within the series, it's just, when I'm reading this, I don't see this as different from like in video games when you're doing a boss, you know, you're doing like the final boss fight, and then out of nowhere like a giant space fleet comes out. It's the real final boss. I see that as no different, just because in this case we're over 320 chapters into the series, and now is when we find out about this person, this big deal. And just the way that everything is kind of set up here just makes it feel weird. I mean, you're looking at All for One like on page 5, and the man is like shaking his fist as he talks about an opportunity. Like when you hear him say, but should I manage to steal her quirk? You know, he's so excited. He's talking like, yeah, he said it's a massive opportunity. His fists are shaking. He looks like a kid in a candy store, which is actually really hard to do. So props on the author for that. In just one chapter, he's elevated this character to be such a big deal, and it's just, again, odd. Now, mind you, if we were to talk about, in general writing, there's nothing wrong with bringing in unknown elements. Like, when you're at the beginning of the story, you should be bringing unknown elements many times. But we are in the final act here, and that's why the bringing in of this unknown element is strange. And the reason that this is important that I tell you what I'm thinking here is because it kind of influences how I think that what might happen with her in the future. Because really, when you bring an unknown element in, that's one of the easiest things you could ever do whenever you're writing something, because an unknown element doesn't really require any build-up. It doesn't require any kind of attachments to the rest of the story. You can pretty much introduce the element and then just connect it from the moment you introduce it. And ultimately, when you bring someone in like that, it's very easy to remove them out of the story as well, or make them less important, because the story didn't have any real connection to the character. So, because of that, especially when we're talking about the removal, that's the thing that concerns me the most. He brought her in, he sets her up as like the biggest symbol, the biggest pinnacle, the biggest obstacle. Like, actually, What are All for One's words here? The ultimate opportunity, the greatest obstacle. In 2 chapters, this girl is the big one. And, what does that ultimately mean for her? Now, there's many options, but I think the option that we should all be very concerned about is the possibility that this girl is going to be a sacrifice for Shigaraki. Now, ideally, that doesn't happen. Ideally, we don't get a full-on embarrassment of the states here. And ideally, this girl doesn't get screwed over. But you never really know. The lack of care with which she was introduced already is kind of concerning. Now, other options include that, oh, she's able to put up a fight against Shigaraki. The problem here is, if she puts up a fight with Shigaraki, and she gets away without being injured or without being sidelined, then All for One's going to have a really hard time. If Shigaraki is able to take the quirk and she is effectively crippled, then that is probably better for All for One. Now, really, when I'm looking at it, I think if the author is saying that this girl is the biggest obstacle to All for One in the entire world, in my mind, it makes sense either crippling her or taking away her quirk. And taking away her quirk in particular, if the author does that, that really just tells me that Shigaraki and Izuku, that's it. In taking down Shigaraki, the person with, I guess, the most powerful quirk in the world, which is hers, Izuku has now become truly the greatest person in the world. And I'm not sure if I'm willing to say that the author won't try to make some statement about Izuku being the best hero in the world when it comes to the overall fighting power here. So I'm very concerned for her. We could also do something very creative where she survives round 1 and she's able to repel Shigaraki with her quirk intact. And then when they have round 2 is when her quirk gets taken. I think that would be actually, if we're gonna take away her quirk, I think that would be the most fair thing to do, because then it doesn't make her look like a chump. There's also another thing that if we get to see the fight, this is also going to be power exposition for both of them. We're going to realize, okay, well, I guess this is why this girl is such a big deal, and we'll see Shigaraki is actually a pretty, he's a big deal as well. So there will be a purpose in seeing Shigaraki have this fight, which very appreciated. Now, if you weren't to ask me, what exactly would I have liked here, and what exactly my overall, grievance with Star and Stripe is, it's pretty much just execution. I don't think there's anything wrong with having her exist in the world. I think the way that she's introduced, the execution makes me very fearful for the character, just because the execution, I find it to be relatively cheap. Again, bringing in information that no one had any way of knowing about before is always going to be one of the cheaper maneuvers that you can pull off. And then when you're doing cheap maneuvers, you need to make sure you execute. In terms of what the author could have done to have make her introduction, I think, a little bit more worthwhile for my style of reading, honestly, the kids go to hero school. If this girl is literally the #1 hero, then while you're talking about America and the heroes of America, heck, talk about her. If she's the biggest deal, reference her. When you look at the author, and just to give you an example, the author is really good at foreshadowing. We know how the author foreshadowed Destro and Mr. Compress's ancestor. And also, when you look at Endeavor and you look at Ending name dropped Hawks' father's name. The author is really good at foreshadowing things, and when you have, quite literally, the biggest symbol in the world, instead of talking about the symbol of peace so often, heck, just mention whoa, the America, they have a course on just heroes in the world that you need to know about, right? In a hero school, it makes complete sense to just kind of name drop Star and Stripe, Salam, and Big Red Dot. But mind you, that in of itself might be a side effect from the author not really having a well-developed world. I do think it's really interesting that in these 2 chapters, we have found out a lot about the rest of the world here, in terms of just the connections that All for One has and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately, if I was to give you my final word on this Star and Stripe, I'm very concerned for her. When I see the way that she's introduced, I really hope this is just a case of like bad execution due to the nature of a publication, and not because the bad execution is indicative of how she's going to be treated in the future. I do hope that we are in a situation where both Shigaraki and Star and Stripe get respected, and they are both shown to be very competent. I think the author has to make this pretty worthwhile. I do think there's also the possibility that the author off-screens a good chunk of the fight, but we'll have to see. Like one thing that also just kind of bothers me is how All For One is talking about this girl so much and just kind of, he downplays One For All, and it's like, all right, All For One, yeah, sure, whatever, man, whatever. I hope you get her. Like, I see a gotcha collector in her. I see a gotcha collector in All For One. And it's like, right now, All For One wants to get this super rare quirk. I don't know if he's going to get it. I don't know how much money he's going to have to spend to get it, but we'll have to see. There are a few things here that I think do make it concerning for Star and Stripe. So with that, let's do the chapter page-by-page walkthrough. We're not going to start with page 1 because that's just Star and Stripe posing. Her design, man. Like, some shots are good. Some shots I'm not a fan of. It's a forehead. Page 2. Now, this is really interesting. We laughed about it because All For One's in a cave. In a way, you could say this is very appropriate for All For One. But we see All For One. He's sitting on a kind of broken throne. Honestly, looking at the chair, this looks very uncomfortable. I feel bad for him that he has such a weird chair. Where are the armrests? He really should have some armrests. This is a dumb chair. I don't know why it's broken too. Where did they get this out of? Like, well, whatever. All For One is the king of ruin. He might not actually, this guy might have been very poor. He might not actually know what it is to live in luxury. He feels a little bit better being around broken things. Anyway, we see him around Nomu. So the Nomu are loving him. So clearly he's the master of zombies. Good for him. We also have this shot here of the cave. Now, I do love their sense of camouflage. I do love like having... This is pretty much the nature equivalent of a bead curtain, except worse. But I do appreciate it. It looks like a very nice cave. Not gonna lie, I don't know where they are because it kind of looks like a jungle. There's a few cool flowers here. Whenever you see flowers, I always get concerned because flowers have meanings. Now, they're not red spider lilies, which is the only flower that I know of or that I know well enough because anime always references red spider lilies. But as for this one, yeah. If anyone knows the flower meaning for this one, let me know. It's just like the author took time to draw them, which is probably... might be worth looking into. The problem with flowers is that if you don't know the flower, it's going to take a while to find it. Anyway, on this page, All For One starts hyping up the big deal of America, or specifically Star and Stripe. A crucial moment is nigh. Also worth pointing out, if Star and Stripe ends up having her quirk stolen, we're not even going to talk about how difficult it's going to be, right? If she ends up having her quirk stolen, she pretty much made this entire thing harder for the heroes. And then she also pretty much set it up for Izuku to take on the ultimate enemy. But whatever. We ultimately have All For One saying the basic stuff of like, yeah, everyone did a distraction and they couldn't find us. And they played hide and seek pretty well in this cave. On page 3, this spinner panel was very funny to me because White Despair, a commenter, always has Spinner being the straight man. And actually seeing Spinner be the straight man in the comic does fill me with joy, and I can't help but think of White Despair. But we could have also won by just leaving the country. Yes, yes. And then All For One goes into his big hamminess of like, whoa, 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 hey man, that's not what I'm thinking. This is just short term. So All For One is still very fixated on Japan in general. And here's the interesting line where he says that obtaining One For All was the mid-game goal. Now, I'm not going to lie. When we were on the live stream, we were making fun of this line because it's like, okay, All For One, you really want that quirk, right? But actually seeing it in context makes a lot more sense. Like, yeah, that makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that One For All would be the mid-game goal because All For One has more plans beyond One For All. He's a collector. He just wants it, I'm pretty sure, he just wants his brother to be with him. And he just wants, the completionist bonus of getting One For All, the ultimate quirk that he could never have, right? He is a whale in a gacha game. Anyway, he wants it, so that makes sense to me that he has plans beyond One For All. Now, the next part that I think is very interesting, and again, we have to analyze everything that All For One says, is that All For One has planned for a long life. I believe him. And this is important when it comes to the whole situation with, like, is All For One going to take over Shigaraki? For anyone that doesn't know, the official stance on this channel is that Shigaraki is too useful to be taken over completely. So the best thing that is we're probably going into a symbiotic type of relationship, just because Shigaraki's hate factory is still needed. So a full takeover of Shigaraki doesn't make sense at this point in the game. But mind you, what you have to look here is that he wants to live for a long time. So I believe, well, and I'll flesh this out maybe another day, but All For One has a plan up to the mid-game point. And after that, I think the next plan that leads to the long life and how he's going to live it opens up at that point. Anyway, he wants to get to the mid-game point, and then he talks about how this one moment is the greatest obstacle and the ultimate opportunity. So then we go into page 4 and 5, which is pretty much just a exposition and hype up page. We find out All For One does in fact have friends all around the world. We find out that All Might was really only the symbol of peace for Japan, and that organized crime is thriving elsewhere. And we find out Star and Stripe is the strongest woman in the world, and she doesn't really care about cheap tricks and petty tactics. I do think like the fan translations mentioned that Star and Stripe was single-handedly preventing the rest of the world from going to the shitter, but whatever. Anyway, page 5 I think was really good because, again, you see that little pose that All For One has, and when you're looking at that pose, he really does seem like a little kid. He seems like he's having a lot of fun here. Now, what I do want to point out here is that if the translation are correct, is that he says, but should I manage to steal her quirk? So that's really interesting because Shigaraki also has All For One. So when he says I managed to steal her quirk, what exactly is he trying to say there? When he says I, does he mean to say that Shigaraki stealing the quirk is still him stealing the quirk? Like he sees Shigaraki as an extension of himself and therefore a tool? Or is he saying that he himself is going to be the one to take the quirk and give Shigaraki a copy or something later when they get the doctor back, if they ever do? That's like the big question I have here. He's still looking at this from his perspective. And again, the joy that he has here, really interesting. This is and when you consider that he has a long plan, All For One does want to stay here for a while. He wants to have a continued existence to some degree here. Also, I realize I didn't make fun of All For One's man cave enough, but worth pointing out some little things here. First off, this cave, look at all, like, I wonder where they get these lights from. They have some nice little boxes here, and they have these little machines here. Just interesting stuff, All For One, interesting stuff. He must have many man caves all around Japan. Now, page 6 is where we go into a quick bit, which is a little bit awkward in that it's trying to create, like, some kind of societal movement. Now, on the first third, what we find out is that All For One is calling Dobby by his first name, and he's pointing out that Dobby really isn't that devoted to All For One, which I'm sure All For One is fine with, and we only have Spinner being fully devoted, guarding him. We go on, and we see that All For One will be utilizing Shigaraki in the coming days, which makes sense. It's worth pointing out that if Spinner is going to be helping Shigaraki, he's going to be away from All For One. And we also have the mutant shape discrimination plot point coming back into it. Now, if there was something that I find really surprising, it's that the mutant shape plot point has so much relevance, and really bad on the anime for skipping out so much of it. But I guess we're going to be doing mutant shape discrimination. I guess, like, if we're talking about whether or not this was built up well, it was built up well. It was built up well from the moment that Spinner brought it up, and it was reinforced when the giant lady was talking about it again. Mutant shape discrimination is an issue that we know is happening in the Hero Academia world. That it's going to be a point that they're going to use in their propaganda is really interesting. And also, it's propaganda because All For One himself acknowledged it as one who spins the tale, right? He's adding spin to it, right? So that's an interesting incorporation of his name. It's interesting that we are going on to such... It's an interesting avenue for liberation. Honestly, interesting platform. I can't say that I expected this was going to be the thing that comes out of this. And now this kind of justifies why people were dressed like Spinner when we saw them way back when during the Izuku solo days. Anyways, people sympathize with Spinner in the shadows. And then we go into the page of the Liberation Army advisors. And this is really cool because we knew that this guy was going to be showing up for quite a while because it was in the volume preview. So cool to see him here. And it's actually cool to see all members of Spinner's original group. We also see this girl. And, you know, I like her design, so it's cool to see her. Anyway, At this point, we learn about how Skeptic outlasted his peers, which we knew, and we find out that Skeptic is telling these guys to continue the whole thing of liberation. Now, when we go into Skeptic, I think it's really interesting here what he's ultimately saying. That being that the League is good enough as a symbol. Like, we can just use them just like how Redestro initially wanted to. We have the one panel of Toga. We know that they're playing out the tragedy of Toga. Toga probably doesn't feel her life as a tragedy, but they're going to spin everything whichever way they want to. Then we have the quick sequence of Dobby, and I do think it was a good idea to put the message, it makes no difference whether or not the League are true liberators, because Dobby most likely doesn't care about that kind of stuff, so that was really appropriate. We see that he's out in the woods. Maybe he's just hanging around the woods. Also, the translator went through the effort of writing out the propaganda or translating the propaganda. I would recommend reading it, but it's not really anything big aside from the rhetoric that they're pushing. Anyway, we have pretty much elevating Spinner to the level of a symbol. And once you're doing that, like, this is the kind of stuff, once you're entering into the realms of make them into a divine creature, this is where we have to talk about Stain, because Stain is another character who's super zealot, so he might come back and be the one to talk to Spinner and tell him, like, hey, you ain't God, All Might is. Like, we might actually see a little bit of a religious fight occurring between the Liberation Army and Stain, which would be hilarious. Now, the most interesting thing on these pages is page 9's. After Shigaraki has destroyed things, we will create, or we will sow the seeds of the future. Or we will sow the seeds of the future. That's really interesting, because that's saying that they think they're going to survive Shigaraki destroying everything. We move on into the Endeavor and Best Jeanist and Hawks segment, which is pretty much just everyone, again, talking about Star, setting her up, being like, yo, I want to talk to her. Wow, she's so cool. We see context to where exactly Endeavor and the group was going. I do wonder why Endeavor's kind of just flying instead of just not being in the car and conserving his strength, but whatever. If he's flying, ideally he'll be able to fly out to go help Star. Maybe. Anyway, here we find out that a report came in and that 50 kilometers ahead of the landing point is Shigaraki. Now, we see Shigaraki's hand on the next page. Honestly, it's a wasted page. There's just a page there for the cool factor. We see Star approaching with her fleet of super cool jets. And we go into the final sequence, which is Star posing similar to the Silhouettes pose that we saw way back when the international heroes were shown in silhouette. And we have an interesting segment here where you have Shigaraki probably in a suit. You have Star asking whether or not Shigaraki is the one they call All for One. And then you have Shigaraki asking, what exactly am I? Now, in the original fan translations, the line was, who exactly am I? Which, to me, I still think makes more sense. Because when you look at the question, are you the villain they call All for One? All for One isn't necessarily a symbol. It's a person right now. So I feel like who would have been the better thing to ask. We do know from the Japanese, though, that Shigaraki's in control now because of the way he refers to himself. But I do wonder if there was some other nuance within the original Japanese that indicated whether or not to say who or what. It's just like in terms of what. Like, Shigaraki's an abomination created by science that we've known about for a very long time. I really do think the more interesting question is who Shigaraki is exactly. And if he had asked who he is, that would have been a little bit more interesting to dissect, only because the identity issue is much more compelling than his state as a non-human. And at this point, Shigaraki's an augmented human, so he's kind of like transcended the realms of humanity already. So as we go into the next week, we have to be ready for anything. Now, the editorial note for this chapter, we know that, let me just get the note here. The ending teaser was they confront each other in airspace, which makes it seem like we're going to see some of the fight next week, but fingers crossed. Overall, a pretty simple chapter of Hero Academia. It tells us what the villains want to do next, and it gives us, I guess, the next big checkpoint for All for One. Will All for One be able to severely hamper Star and Stripe, or will he be able to take her quirk and create the ultimate villain for Izuku to face? Remember, at the end of the day, this is still Izuku's story. Izuku's going to be fighting the ultimate villain by the end of it. Star and Stripe is most likely not going to be there to deal with it. And in terms of whether or not, like, has any ending villain ever been weakened for the main character to deal with? Kind of depends. It kind of depends. Some characters go crazy right when they have all their power come in. Other characters are so strong that the main characters have to get a temporary power up to be able to beat them. Let's see. Other characters beat through the power of love. Yeah, yeah, we'll have to see. Anyway, guys, let me know what you thought down below. And till next time, I hope you have an absolutely great day.